SQL Server availability groups. So availability groups are another type of cluster, and these can be 2 nodes or more. They start out with the same underlying cluster construct, except all of the nodes have active instances. With SQL Server failover clusters, you don't have to have an active instance on every node. It can be just the failover instance, which is only on one node at a time. With availability groups, they're on all. And that's important because it allows the nodes to be in different data centers. And instead of using shared storage, there's actually each node has its own copy of the databases that are in the availability group. Availability groups therefore span instances. And these are some fundamental concepts that are important because as we talk about what Actifio can and can't do with availability groups, it's important to always keep these particular items in mind. So an instance in an availability group, one instance in an availability group is designated primary and it's read-write. The other instances are designated secondary and they're generally online but read-only. There are some options where they don't necessarily have to be online, but how I see it deployed, call it 98% of the time, is that they are online. People use those secondaries not just for failover, but sometimes for reporting as well. So in addition, because you have this different style relationship where the availability group, it's not bound to a single instance, you also have the option to have multiple availability groups in a single instance and crossing different instances on different servers, all within the context of a cluster. You could put databases into availability groups, and the settings for where's primary and where's secondary, those are actually managed at the availability group level. So you could have a 2-node availability group cluster, for example, where node A has availability group 1 and 2, and node B has availability group 1 and 2. But availability group 1 is primary on node A, and availability group 2 is primary on B. And then you can rearrange, so they're both primary on the same, or on A or on B, or you could continue to have them split. But the granularity of control for the availability group and which one is primary, that's at the group level. All of the databases you put in the group are bound by that same relationship. Discovery is handled much the same as it is for SQL Server failover clusters, where when you discover on the first host, all of the hosts show up, and then you run discovery on all nodes. Databases that are in availability groups are not shown in the UI under the availability or under the SQL instance. They're shown under an availability group, and I'll show you that in just one second. And then you only want to back up databases that are in availability groups in one place. Right? This is a big difference between SQL Server failover clusters versus availability groups. Failover clusters, the instance only exists in one place. You just have to find the active one and back it up from there. Availability groups, the database actually exists in multiple places at the same time with different roles, primary versus secondary. And you can back them up from either one that you like, the primary or the secondary, or any one of the secondaries if you have multiple secondaries. So that's kind of an important concept to understand there. As a result of this design and the fact that availability groups are not linked to a single instance, we do not have the ability today, as well as the fact that the different instances can be in different data centers, we don't have the ability today to do instance level or availability group level dynamic protection with availability groups. If you think about it, it makes sense. The different, where am I going here? The different nodes can be in different data centers. Different data centers probably have different Actifio appliances. So if you want to say, hey, I always want to back up the primary, and the primary is a data center 1, and then later you change the role so that the primary is now at data center 2, now you're talking about running backups on a different appliance even. It's not going to be a simple appliance level setting. So we're building some enhanced integration to do things like detect the location of the different instances and servers using Active Directory sites and services, for example, and then linking certain appliances to certain sites. But that's a direction we're headed. That's not something that's available today. So for today, the way that we've implemented it is we've said you can use consistency groups or individual databases to back up these availability group databases. And the node that's used for backup is up to you. The default behavior is back it up from the primary. Now this is something that gets people scratching their heads for a moment until they give it a little bit deeper thought. And the reason I say that is because most customers out there who use availability groups have gotten very accustomed to the concept of running the backups from the secondary. And the reason they've become accustomed to that is because in the traditional backup paradigm, where you're doing full backups regularly, if not daily, that's a pretty big impact on the server. And Microsoft introduced the ability to do the backups from the secondary specifically so that you don't have that impact on the primary production server, to separate those workloads. Actifio, on the other hand, does this change block tracking incremental forever kind of backup. And without availability groups, there is really no choice. You're always backing up from the primary. So the fact that we've made it such a lower impact and that you can run it without impacting production, to us means go ahead and back it up from the primary if you like. We don't have any problem with that. But at the same time, we recognize customers oftentimes really want to back it up from the secondary. They feel like that's the lower risk option. And so what we've done is we've given you the ability to specify where the backup should run from. That's what this service access point IP is. And I'll show you where that setting is set in just a moment. But setting this value basically tells us, don't look at where the primary is. Don't look at that virtual IP address of the primary. Instead, go ahead and use this specific node for the backups. And so the typical deployment with Actifio and availability groups is you use that service access point IP and you specify the secondary, and you just always let it back up from the secondary. If you have a role reversal where the secondary becomes the primary, you don't actually have to make any changes. Most often those role reversals are temporary. You did it during the maintenance window of some sort anyway, and therefore, if a backup or two runs while it's the primary instead of the secondary, it doesn't really hurt anything. And then when the roles reverse back again, you just continue to back up from the secondary where you are. So you don't necessarily need that dynamic following to avoid the primary. It's something that we are going to add into the product as we have the site awareness, but there's some other impacts there. You know, if you're turning off backups at site A and turning them on at site B because of a role change, you have to understand the storage consumption impact of that and whether or not it's going to be an incremental or a full. Hint, right now it would be a full the first time after the failover. So there are some consequences there. We'll be enhancing our integration with availability groups even further in the future. But for now, we have what seems to be a pretty workable, good solution here that people initially look at and say, hey, that's not quite how I want it. But once they start using it and they understand the lower impact, it turns into a pretty good solution for them. So the last thing is, and I mentioned this before, we don't dynamically protect the entire group. Again, that's something that we're going to be adding so that when you automatically add, or when you add databases to the group, they'll automatically get included. But we don't do it today because there are a couple of consequences here. For example, I already talked about the different sites, but what if you take a database out of an availability group? Well, that database is now a standalone database. It is eligible, if you will, to be backed up as part of the instance. And then when you add a database to an availability group, it effectively stops being an independent database and it becomes linked to the group. So again, there's some consequences there as you add and remove databases that we wanted to make sure we gave you the right visibility and that you understood the right consequences of how much storage would be consumed and where and when as you make those changes. And because of that, we're kind of taking slower steps into the dynamic approach. The first step was with 7.1, dynamic on the SQL instance, so that every time you add a database, you don't need to go and manually add to a consistency group the way we had used to in the past. The next step will be to get that level of dynamic protection into availability groups. But again, we have a couple of I's to dot and T's to cross to make sure that people always understand the impact as those changes take place. So let's take a quick peek at the UI to see what all of this looks like. So I was over here before, and I showed you the SQL failover cluster. If I scroll down a bit further, you'll see I've got SQL availability groups down here. And under them, I'll have a list of the availability groups that are present. Each one is listed with the availability group name. In this case, SQL AAG is the name of the group. SQL AAG list, that stands for a listener. So that's the listener as defined, meaning it has its own dedicated IP to connect to that particular SQL availability group. That's actually not a requirement. Not every SQL availability group has a listener set up. If there isn't one set up, we just list the cluster name here instead that it's running on. If there is a listener, we list the listener. And then the databases, they can be backed up individually or as part of a consistency group. Usually people go with a consistency group. In this particular test environment here, I just have a single one, and it's protected as part of an individual database. It's not protected as part of a consistency group. You can ignore this one. This is just something that somebody stood up as a part of another test. I'm in a shared demo environment here. If I go to a particular database or a consistency group, and I go to advanced settings, this is where I get access to those settings that I was mentioning before, the service access point IP address. And you can see I've got one in here that's defined. You also can see in the left-hand side here in the background that when I selected the database, it doesn't just show me the appliance IP address, but it shows me the cluster name, SQL AAG CL, which doesn't match the listener name, right? But it also shows me the nodes. So it shows me all the nodes that are available in that availability group. And then further down under network name, it shows me the listener if there is one, as well as here's the network IP I was thinking of before. So this is how you tell the system which node to use. And in this case, 92 is going to be my node 1. 93, I think, is going to be my node 2. And then 94 is going to be my listener. But this is how I tell it where to run the backup from. And this one is a fairly recently added option, use service IP for restore. What that does is it changes our historically default behavior for restores for availability groups. So I've got a whole topic to talk about for restores for availability groups here. And specifically, when you do a restore of an availability group, we have to, what you basically want to do is you want to get the data to all of the nodes because they all have their own copy, right? So the way that we did it in the past was we connected to the primary always, not to where you ran the backup from, even if you ran it from the secondary. And on the primary, we basically evicted the database on the primary from the availability group. We did a restore, and then we rejoined it into the group in a way that forced it to resynchronize the database to the other nodes. Now, while that approach works, it's really not ideal, especially in a larger environment. So what we've done is we've added a better way, and I'm going to talk about this topic next. That's the clone topic. You see the next header show up there for a moment. The idea here is, rather than having SQL Server recopy the data to all the nodes in the availability group, it would really be ideal to go ahead and restore them from the local appliance in each location. So if you have two sites, Site A and Site B, and each one has an Actifio appliance, and you're backing up the data, for example, at Site B and replicating it to Site A, it'd be really great to put the data back in both sides locally from the local copy that's there, rather than having it replicate across the wire. And so what we've done is we say, use this option, use service IP for restore. And by doing that, it means that if you perform a restore, it doesn't go to the primary, it doesn't evict and set it up in a way that's going to force a re-replicate, but instead it'll just do the restore back to the node that you ran the backup from. So that was kind of a safeguard that we put in, and we do at this point recommend selecting that option. It's not enabled by default, but we're actually considering changing that. However, the restore in Actifio terminology, the restore is really still, how do I explain it? The definition of a restore in Actifio is to put the data back where it came from, to overwrite the data that's there. Most backup software that you deal with, you use the word restore and you choose where to restore to. But in Actifio, the concept of putting the data back to somewhere different than where it came from, that's what we call cloning. So fairly recently, in the 8.0 release, we added the first generation of this clone feature. And it was specifically for availability groups. And the way that we've implemented what it does is it allows you to pick any target that you want, and it copies the data from the Actifio disks to that particular target. And by using this approach, it's effectively saying, I can, at site A, do a clone onto the SQL availability group node at site A, and at site B, I can also do a clone from that appliance to the availability group node at site B. It doesn't matter if we're doing the copy from the original appliance that was used for the backup, or if we're doing it on the appliance that has a replicated copy of it. It works just the same on both. And so as a best practice for SQL Server availability groups, we usually say just use the clone feature rather than restore. The only time you really need to use restore or might want to use restore is if you want to save one step, and that step is overwriting or deleting the source database that you're going to basically restore over. Restore knows it's overwriting something, so if it sees the database is still there, it'll actually delete it. Clone is intended for a more general usage. I want to take a copy of this database, copy it to the local disks on some server. I don't want to overwrite anything that's there. This isn't a restore, this is a clone. And so for clone, you do have to manually go ahead and delete those databases first.
Thank you for joining us for another YouTube Tech Tip video. If you like the content you're seeing on this channel, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you will be alerted to any future content.